athletes, Travis from GTS Rowing here. In this video, I'm going to try to take you through all the information you need to select the right set of oars for your own use, whether you're choosing them from a selection at your local club or if you're purchasing your own. Hopefully this video will go in detail and cover all the questions you might have in terms of what set of oars is best for you. So I'm going to be talking more specifically about sculling oars in this discussion, though almost everything I'm going to talk about is also going to apply to sweep oars. So feel free to kind of use this video for either or. I have a lot of experience buying oars. I've probably bought between 3 and 4 dozen sets of oars over the course of my career for my program and for myself. And so a lot of experience with this, and also working with the athletes on the water, seeing what works and what doesn't. And I know as much as anybody who's been in that position that the last thing you want to do is spend $1,000, $3,000 on a set of oars and not be super happy with what you got after using it for a couple months. All right, so hopefully this video will help you avoid those mistakes to make sure that you're investing one time in what you need and you don't have any buyer's remorse. So focusing on the sculling, all right, so I have a sculling oar here. When you are selecting the oar, there's several different factors that you're going to want to consider. One is going to be the blade shape, also the blade size. 2 is going to be the shaft, both the materials that you're using for the shaft, the stiffness of the shaft, and also the length of the shaft, as that's going to determine the length of the overall oar. You have your sleeve and collar here. There's going to be some selection in terms of collars, I think specifically, and sleeves with it. Some of the more kind of innovative companies have done some work trying to get collars that you can actually adjust on the water, which is a great function. I'm all for that kind of technology and pushing that forward and making it as practical as possible. I do think being able to kind of change the load on your oars on the fly is very important. But I think for most people that's going to be less of a consideration. All right, so collar and sleeve are going to be pretty standard on whatever set of oars that you get from whatever company you choose. The next consideration is going to be whether your handle is adjustable or fixed. All right, almost all sculling oars and sweep oars these days are adjustable. I highly recommend getting adjustable unless you know exactly what length you need and what purpose you need it for. The only programs I think would ever be in that situation are high performance athletes that are going to go compete at the World Championship, and they know exactly what oar they want, exactly what length they need, and even those crews will often have adjustable oars just because they might want to kind of switch some settings in case it's windy or choppy or for any other reason on the fly. So your final consideration is going to be your grip. So there are going to be lots of different options for grip. It's almost exclusively a consideration of feel and comfort, not necessarily performance. They're all going to perform well. There's no kind of better or worse for that. It's really just kind of what feels good in your hands and what allows you to kind of take your strokes and execute your strokes as efficiently as possible and as comfortable as possible, because comfort equals speed in a sport like rowing, pretty much any other sport. So those are going to be options. We're going to start, and I'll try to split this up in the chapters so you guys can kind of skip through, but we're going to start at the handle side with the grips. So there are a couple different options for grips and materials for grips, and so your primary options are going to be kind of a rubber, so either a soft rubber or a hard rubber. You might also have a wood vinyl, which is the way they've essentially allowed to bring a wood handle to the adjustable setting. All right, because if you do have wood handles, solid wood handles on your oar, you're not going to have an adjustable oar. So they have this kind of veneer. Concept 2, I think, was the first one to kind of start doing it. I'm not sure if other companies have picked up on it, but those are the options that you're going to have. What's best? It's just your personal preference, all right? So the oar that I'm using for demonstration here is a croaker oar. The grips on croakers are kind of, they have their signature is just that they have little grooves where your fingers are supposed to sit on that oar, kind of help keep them in the right place. That being said, I've seen lots of rowers use kind of variations on a grip, and so maybe those grooves aren't where you want. But for, I would say, 90-95% of rowers, those grooves are gonna put your hand where it should be on the handle, which is essentially flush to the end. All right, the only option, I've seen some athletes kind of come off the end. I've seen some athletes choke up. You know, I know the Irish lightweights, one of the Scullers really likes to kind of choke up on the oar. And so if they can do it and won world championships doing it, then obviously there's something to it. But for most of us, being on the end of the oar is what you want. The other options for grips, you have the hard plastic, you might have ridges. Again, it's just the best option you can have is try a lot of grips. The grips on sculling oars, you can take them off, put them back on. The only problem is that once you take it off, you usually have to destroy it to take it off, so it's not like you can buy 4 or 5 and just kind of plop them on and replace them and figure out which one you like, and then once you find the one, put that one back on. It's really just I suggest, pick a couple different options at the club or some friends that have other options, or just experiment on your own. Grips are not super expensive. It costs about $15 for a set, and so it's very easy to replace. My personal preference was a Martinoli grip. It's kind of like a soft rubber with a nice texture, kind of a grid, waffly type of texture. The Stanley also has that texture, though the Martinoli felt a little bit, I like the softer side, and it was grippier. It was a little bit easier for me to use when it got wet, and actually a lot of times we'll deliberately wet my oars when I'm rowing to get all the sweat off, because the sweat is a lot more slippery than just water. But the Martinolis, they wear out really quick, and so we'd usually have to replace them 2-3 times a year per set. But again, it's not super expensive. If you're rowing enough to need to cycle out your grips that often, then $15 here and there is not that big a deal. All right, but a lot of options there. Try them out, figure out what's best. The next thing we want to be thinking about when we're thinking about grips is in the handle is the diameter of the handle. All right, other than the stiffness of the shaft, I think this is the other element that gets overlooked in kind of a club setting where you're using oars that are not your own. So it's going to be very important, especially if you're purchasing your own, to get the right grip diameter. And so generally there's going to be 3 diameters. There's going to be a standard diameter handle, there's going to be a small handle, there's going to be a larger handle. All right, so who will do what, and what of those diameters are good for different situations? So as female athletes, I think one of the problems with, or the things that female athletes struggle, or coaches of female athletes struggle with, is that handles tend to be bigger than they should be. All right, and so it's very important, and this is the same thing with shoes. I mean, when I was a rower, the shoes were all oversized because they had to fit everybody, and so most of the people had to row with a shoe that was too big, because nobody can row with a shoe that's too small, so you can only go in one direction. I think the same tends to happen with the grip diameter, is that a lot of people get stuck rowing with grip diameters that are bigger than they need. Having the appropriate grip diameter, especially in sculling, extremely important. And so for me, we would have a small diameter for almost all female athletes, maybe kind of like the bigger female athletes, the more kind of like a D1 athlete, high performance female athlete that's going to be sized bigger than the average male. Those athletes might benefit from a standard diameter handle, but for the most part, high school female athletes are going to benefit from a small diameter handle, as well as younger, smaller male athletes. And so your middle school males, maybe your lightweight males, the guys that haven't hit puberty yet, that are still kind of in the the low 5s or mid 5 foot range. All right, and their hand is going to be appropriate, proportionally small for that. So other than that, standard diameter handle for most male athletes, and kind of the higher end female athletes that have big hands. And then the wider diameter handle, really just for kind of big dudes. All right, so top level D1 size guys, high performance size guys might benefit from that bigger handle. What's going to happen if you have a handle that's too big? What's going to happen if you have a handle that's too small? If you have a handle that's too big, it's just going to be hard to manipulate a handle the way it should be. All right, when you're sculling, you want to be a lot in the fingers and the thumb. All right, so your feathering should be a lot of this. and then it should be a lot of rolling of the fingers to get it back square. Whereas in sweep, you're gonna have a little bit more wrist action, but you're still gonna wanna try to use those fingers as much as possible. If that grip is too big, you're not gonna be able to get that nice light action here. You're gonna be more kind of like revving your motorcycle at the back end, which we do not want, all right? We want a nice flat wrist. We wanna be able to kind of feather that blade with the fingers if you're in a single scull. If the blade is too big, it's gonna be hard to do that. If the blade is small, all right, it's gonna be a lot easier, but if it gets too small, then you might not be able to get that grip, all right? So finding that right size is gonna be important for you. For me personally, I always use standard, so I'm a 5'8", former lightweight guy, so when I'm not overweight, I'm generally in the 160 range, currently sitting more in the kind of 185, 195 range. But my hand is the same size. I use a standard diameter handle. Most of the oars, most of the athletes I had would also use that. I don't think we had any oar handles in my youth rowing program that wore a large diameter handle. All right, so you really got to be a bigger guy to really need that large diameter. The small diameter handle, I sometimes actually preferred using a small diameter handle when I was just doing steady state, so kind of low rate stuff. It's nice. I felt like I got a little bit more purchase on that oar, can manipulate it a little bit easier because I could just kind of play with it in my hands a little bit better. However, once I started increasing the rate, I needed that little extra purchase of a standard grip handle in order to go. And so it was more of like, pick a standard that's available, but if I needed to grab a small diameter handle and I was just doing steady state, I would be fine. Same thing I would imagine for a heavyweight athlete. They're gonna be fine with the standard, but once those rates get up, if you're finding them struggle to kind of manipulate that oar handle without kind of doing the revving the motorcycle, whereas they were doing just fine at steady state, that would be an indication that the handle is not quite as big as it needed to be. So that's what we have for the grip diameter. For the adjustability, all right, so that's going to be our next section here, is talking about the adjustable options on your oar. So oars are going to have adjustability both in the handle here with either screws, or I know Concept 2 has one where at the handle you basically screw, and the act of screwing it is what's going to move it up and down. Most of the oars like this Croaker here, you're going to loosen some screws and then the handle is going to slide up and down to the desired setting. They're all good. The only issue I've ever had, excuse me, with an adjustable oar was the Dreyer sweeps, where they had a single screw that tended to come loose a lot with the sweeps. On the other side, their sculls, never had any issue with that on the sculls, and their Dreyer sculls were actually the sculls that we use the most in my program, both because they're really solid oar and the company was really close, so it was very easy to work with them. Practicality is a big consideration when you're deciding what company to go with your oar. But with the adjustability, it's a simple system across all the programs. And so with the exception of that one kind of situation of Dreyer sweeps, which hopefully they fixed, that was like 12 years ago. So it's been a lot of time for them to get feedback and kind of adjust. But other than that, all solid systems. Adjustability will allow you to lengthen the oar. We'll talk about the length, the gearing on the oar a little bit later in the discussion. As we are talking about manufacturers, let's make that our next focus. And so the primary manufacturers that I've worked with have been Dreyer, where I have the most of my purchases, Concept 2, which is the next most purchases I had, and generally we would focus on Concept 2 for our sweeps, Dreyer for our sculls, and then Croaker. I've not used Croaker sweeps, but we did have a couple sets of Croaker sculls in my program which we used. Other programs or other brands of oars that I don't have personal experience with, but I know are well regarded within the rowing community, are Braca Sport, Inboard makes their own oars. I've also seen Swift use their own oars. I know almost nothing about Swift oars. The Braca, I have seen some solid programs. Probably one of the only programs that could consistently defeat my own athletes at White Quad Cities like to have Braca oars. So clearly, they're capable of performing at a high level. The Inboard oars, I almost never saw Inboard oars in the US. Inboard doesn't have great customer service outside of Europe. I'm assuming they have decent customer service in Europe, but in the US not so much, and so there's not a whole lot of motivation to buy their oars for Scullers in the US. So those are the main companies you want to consider, but we'll talk about Croker, Dreyer, and Concept 2 and kind of the strengths and weaknesses of each. So with the Croker generally I would regard as more of a high performance centered scull, and so I would never purchase them for kind of like the recreational components of our programs, of the development side of our programs. They were definitely more kind of designed with that higher competitive side in mind, and not so much in terms of durability. You know, as a general rule, the more durable you get, the farther you're going to get away from a high performance product. The more high performance you get, the less durable you're going to get. So in my program, because we didn't have the luxury of having a ton of oars that were specifically for our high performance athletes, we only had a couple sets of Krokers, but the Krokers that we did have were very well regarded. I enjoy these a lot. These were actually a gift to me from one of the athletes that I coached, who I think he won national championship with these oars in the single. So, you know, grateful for that. I use them. I like them, and as a company, I think they have a little bit less options than some of the other companies. Again, that might have changed in the last 10 years or so, which is where, you know, probably between 10 and 18 years ago is when I was doing the majority of my oar purchasing, so things might have changed in the meantime. But with Croker, very solid oar, a little bit less options I think in terms of shaft stiffness, which we'll talk about in a little bit, but otherwise in grips, you know, they come with their kind of more proprietary grips, but you can easily pull this grip off and replace it with any other grip, so no big deal. But great oar. Next, the Concept 2. Concept 2 is probably going to have the kind of dominance in the market. I'm fairly confident that Concept 2 makes up the vast majority of oars chosen for the World Championships and Olympics, so clearly a very good and reliable oar. I think that Concept 2, they have a lot of options. You know, they're kind of up there with in terms of innovation, but their customer service is just off the charts good. Croker customer service was great when I was using it because it was mainly just one representative in the country, and because the market weren't many people, you know, doing Croker oars. He did a great job of kind of keeping up with the demand and communications. Concept 2, much bigger company, but also much bigger market, and they do a great job with the customer service. Probably top 2 or top 3 customer service in terms of companies out of the hundreds of companies I've dealt with and vendors throughout my career in terms of the quality customer service. And so Concept 2, very good. They also go to major regattas and kind of offer complimentary kind of adjustment and repairs at those. So I think the Heather Charles, I think there's 1 or 2 others that they'll show up to every year and offer that service, which is a great bonus that we used to try to take advantage of as much as we could. The Concept 2 also has a little bit more options in terms of the shaft. Once we talk about shaft, we'll talk about those options. And then the next company, the company that I used to buy almost all of our sculls was for Durham Boat Company. The sculls were called Dreyer sculls. Very good, very kind of a at the forefront of technology company, kind of very brainiac in terms of the people that are working there. Less customer service oriented, not so much in terms of, you know, a lack of desire for customer service, which I would put more on the Inboard side, but more just less availability. You know, it's a smaller company, really focused on kind of the innovation and manufacture side, but never had any issues resolving any of the questions that I had once I got in touch with them. And again, they were close, and so it was very easy to kind of get back and forth if I needed anything done with our oars. And so I think if you're a program manager watching this video, thinking about the practicality of the oar manufacturers that you choose is going to be great, and just how easy it's going to be to kind of fix oars that are damaged and get replacement parts when you need them. But between those 3 companies that I had experience, never had any issue getting replacement parts and getting someone to answer the phone and help me when I needed it. So Croker, Dreyer, Concept 2, all great options. Brocker Sport, no personal experience, but from what I've observed, also a great company. So back to the specs on the oar. The next spec you're going to think about when you're considering an oar is going to be the shaft. So there's going to be a couple things that we're going to think about in the shaft. We're going to think about the materials that are used in the shaft. It's almost all going to be carbon fiber these days, kind of the days of I don't know what they used back in the day. But they're all carbon fiber now. It's going to be different grades of carbon fiber, and so basically what you're picking out with kind of the higher level oars is just a lighter version of carbon fiber that's going to be able to maintain the stiffness. And so if you want lighter oars, pick the more expensive oars. Great for performance, though in some cases you might want a little bit heavier oar. Certainly kind of as a less experienced athlete, it might be a little bit better to have a slightly heavier shaft. The next consideration is going to be the shape of the shaft. Now these are more recent innovations which I have less experience with. Almost all of the oars are going to be just simple cylinder, all right, nice and round. Though there have been innovations in terms of trying to kind of create more of a aerofoil type of a shape with that oar, so that when you are feathered on the recovery, that when you're coming back, that your oar kind of cuts through and minimizes wind resistance. I have experimented a little bit with that with the Dreyer kind of version. I think those were the first that were really trying to kind of innovate. As I said before, Dreyer is really good at kind of pushing the boundaries of innovation. We use them personally. I didn't really notice enough of a difference. Granted, I wasn't racing in national championships and trying to make the national team at that point in my career, but I still had the knowledge and skills that I had back then. I didn't really notice much of a difference. My athletes didn't really notice much of a difference, and so I wouldn't kind of steer you towards that unless you're a high performance athlete and you just want to kind of experiment and you like trying to play with new things. The other than just kind of an aerofoil type of shape of that oar, we've seen the more recent skinny oars from Concept 2, which is just they're using a different quality of carbon, which allows them to make a skinnier oar, which is going to give them a little bit more options in terms of the flex and the stiffness of that shaft, which is going to be very important. We're going to talk about that in a little bit, but since it is a little bit more skinny, it's going to have the same benefit as the aerofoil, I think they called, the Dreyer called them, but there's going to be a little bit less wind resistance on the oar when you're rowing. That being said, my personal opinion, at no point kind of in my career have I ever kind of been in a situation where I felt a performance enhancement from an oar that was less or more wind resistant. So I would just say, don't worry too much about the shape of the shaft. Think about it more in terms of getting the shaft at the stiffness that you need, which is what we're going to talk about now, which is probably the most kind of misunderstood, poorly selected attribute of oars is going to be the stiffness of that oar. So generally you're going to have a standard stiffness, stiff oars, soft oars. Those are going to be the three that most manufacturers have. I feel, if I'm remembering right, Croker might only have two of those options. I'm not 100%, so don't quote me on that. They might just have the standard and the soft. The Dreyer and the Concept 2 both have soft, standard, and stiff. And then the Concept 2, when they brought in their skinny shaft, also had an extra soft oar. So, how to determine what stiffness is for you? Great question. The stiffness and why you want the right stiffness is that when you're rowing and you're planting your blade in the water at the catch, all right, I guess I'm a starboard for the moment here. So when you place that water in the catch and you start to apply pressure on that blade, that shaft is going to bend, all right? So you have a lot of torque on that blade, a lot of power coming into the handle that's being resisted as a lever on that blade, all right? So one of two levers, one is going to be at the pin, the other is going to be at the center of the blade. So that oar is going to bend. It is very important for your performance for that oar to bend, all right? I could see a common misconception being that you think stiffer is better. That is not the case at all right? Finding the right stiffness for the shaft is going to be very important, because that function of flexing the blade at the catch and then having that energy stored within the shaft, and then as you get closer to the release where there is less pressure on the blade and it's more a matter of speed of the blade, that stored energy is going to release and that blade is basically going to flick back to being stiff and straight. That's very important for getting a clean release and getting a good acceleration of the boat at that back end. Now, what stiffness you want from your shaft is really going to depend on how strong are you as an athlete, all right? And so I would say, based on what your 2K is, determine what kind of stiffness that you need in your shaft. And so for me, in my experience, the vast majority of my athletes used either a soft or a standard stiffness. There were very few athletes that I had that I felt would benefit from a stiff oar. And in fact, I would say, unless you're pulling maybe 6:10 or faster, and I might even push that down to 6 minutes or faster on the erg, I would not recommend a stiff oar. And even for those athletes, I would probably only recommend a stiff oar in competition. I would recommend a standard stiffness oar for training, because it's going to give you a little bit of less pressure on the back for those high miles of training that those athletes are going to do. So stiff, very little population that's going to need a stiff oar. The standard is going to be more broadly used. And so for standard, I would then say for competition, any athlete kind of in the 6 minute 2K range, or 6 minutes, as in from 6 minutes to 7 minutes on a 2K. Standard for competition, I would say maybe for those athletes, they could also stay with standard if they're in the lower 620s. Though for athletes that might be in the higher 6 minutes, so 6:30 to 7 minutes, you'd probably benefit from having a soft oar. In training, sometimes, mainly for your steady state, I would switch to the standard stiffness when you're doing pieces. Obviously, I'm talking as if you have multiple options, all right? Not everyone's gonna have multiple sets of oars. If you're a high performance athlete, high performance program, I would highly recommend having 2 sets of oars with different shaftness based on what you're trying to use it for. For the other 95% of athletes, 1 is fine. And you just got to decide which way you want to go with it. All right. If you just want 1 set and your focus is competition, then go with the stiffer of your 2 options. If your focus is just recreation, having fun, go with the softer of those options. All right. So back to who could use what. So athletes in the kind of 6 minute to 7 minute range, standard stiffness is going to be good in your competition. You might need a soft shaft for training. If you are, and again, for training mainly in the steady state range, if you're doing pieces that day, grab your standard stiffness oars. For female athletes, almost all female athletes I would recommend a soft shaft for. Very few female athletes I would recommend a standard stiffness. Again, going to that erg range, there's not too many female athletes that are sub 7, and definitely very few athletes that are sub 640. And so with those athletes, I would say standard stiffness might be beneficial, though definitely use a soft shaft in training. And then any athletes that are above 7 minutes, whether you're male or female, I think that soft shaft is going to be good. All right. If you're right on that threshold of 7 minutes, maybe you can play with the standard, see if you like it for racing or for pieces. But for training, most definitely soft. And then if you're slower than 7 minutes, certainly if you're 7:20 or slower, a soft shaft for both racing and training. Now, the Concept 2 has an extra soft shaft. I don't have as much experience using that extra soft shaft, but I would imagine that, so I can't tell you like where the erg threshold is, where I think athletes would benefit from that extra soft, but going based on the kind of transition from standard to soft, I would say if your athletes are getting up over the 8 minute range for sculling, then you might want to start to consider trying an extra soft shaft. Now, the other thing to think about when you are talking about that shaft stiffness is what blade you're using, all right? And so the blade, there are a lot of options with blades. Again, like shaft stiffness, or with grips, I should say, the blade, there's not a best blade or less good blade. Every blade shape has its function and its purpose, and it's going to apply to different athletes appropriately based on their particular style, technique, what type of boat they're rowing in. Are they rowing in a small boat, sculling boat, big boat, faster boats, whatever it might be? Those are going to help determine. But more importantly, I think, is going to be the technical style of those athletes. And so the different blade shapes are going to basically connect with the water more or less efficiently. And just like we talked about with the shaft, that stiffer might be more efficient, but it's not necessarily better in terms of performance. Same thing with the blade, all right? So just because the blade is more efficient in its connection with the water doesn't mean that it's better. Generally, most of the blades that you're going to see these days are going to be this type of shape, this kind of square smoothie. The older before this, this blade I think got innovated around in my career, so around the 2000 range. Before that, the shaft just came. You could see the shaft coming into the blade on the front as well as the back. That would be what we call a standard big blade. This is called a smoothie blade, and then there's a variety of different innovations that have come with the smoothie. And so there are different shapes, there are different lengths of the blade, so some might be a little bit longer, a centimeter or two longer. You might also have what we had, the round oars for drayer, and so it's more of kind of a circular, not a perfect circle, but maybe almost a teardrop. And then pretty much all the manufacturers now have their own version of that, kind of a rounded blade. That rounded blade is just going to connect to the water far more efficiently at the front end. It's going to feel a lot heavier there. That's not necessarily the best thing. A lot of athletes don't want a heavy catch. They want a nice light catch so they can be fast and speedy. And so you're going to have to try different oars before you buy yours. Try as many as you can. Take them out for rows. Make sure the other settings are constant or appropriate for that blade shape, and see which one works most effectively for you. I found interesting that the round blade shape we would almost always use in my my women's quads, and so the quad almost always performed better with a round blade, and then when they bumped into singles and doubles, they would almost always perform better with the standard kind of smoothie rectangular blade. And then so that was just, you know, same athletes going from different boat classes, you know, were benefiting from a different kind of power profile through the water, where the quad, because the quad was moving a lot faster, having a blade that connected a lot more efficiently at the front end, helped them get connected through the stroke because maybe they just weren't fast enough on the legs to take advantage, or even if they were fast enough on the legs, you know, having that little extra help with equipment helped them get a more efficient stroke. Whereas when they were in the double was moving, or certainly single, the boat just wasn't moving as fast. They didn't need to be, you know, super fast at the front end to get a good connection and acceleration. And so this blade was great because it allowed them to still be, you know, very efficient and quick through the back end. All right, and so again, it's going to be preference in terms of what works for you. The other thing to consider when you're picking your blade is that you're going to want to get kind of a symbiosis of your blade shape and your oar length and your oar stiffness. All right, and so the more efficient a blade is going to be, the shorter the oar may need to be in order to make sure that you're not overloading yourself. All right, and so again, you know, heavier, more is not better. Just like on the erg, rowing a 10 isn't better, you know, rowing a 1 isn't less good. It's just what's more efficient for what you're trying to achieve. Longer, shorter oars, there's not necessarily a right or wrong. It's what works best with the context of the equipment. And so if you have a wider blade, you're going to need a shorter shaft and oar, so that it doesn't just feel extremely heavy at the front end. All right, so you got to want to find that balance. And so it's important that as you're switching between blade shapes, if you're trying different blade shapes, that you make sure that you're shifting that shaft appropriately. All right, and you just got to talk between different people, or look at data that's available on the internet and figure out what is that difference in terms of how much should you adjust for one shape to another. I know for the sweeps, it was generally about 5 centimeters between the standard smoothie and the fat smoothie blades. The fat smoothie, you know, were generally about 5 centimeters shorter, you know, to get the equivalent feel. On the sculling oars, generally I found them actually pretty consistent between kind of the measurements, because that's the way it worked. So you got to figure out what it is, but you do need to make that adjustment and be aware of it. And so adjust to get the right feeling of load. All right, the blade shape shouldn't be making the stroke heavier or lighter for you. It should be changing how you feel connected through the water and how efficiently you're moving that boat. And you've got to adjust the oar itself in order to kind of get get that feeling. The next thing we're going to talk about is the length. The inboard, which is also kind of probably for the newer athletes going to be the most confusing of all the options. All right, and so with your adjustable handle, you can adjust the overall length of the oar. The length of the oar is going to be from the end of the oar handle here up to the end of the blade in line with the shaft. And so you just kind of take this line here to the end, so measuring about from there to the end of that grip is going to be the overall length of the oar. That's going to be one of your two primary length considerations for the oar. The other is going to be from the end of the collar here to the edge of the grip, and that's what we call the inboard. Now, what are those two things, what are those two measurements kind of represent in terms of how we're rowing, how we're feeling? One, I would switch and convert one of those. And so while you're purchasing an oar, you're going to purchase an oar with a set length, overall length, and an inboard. And so you might order an oar that is 288/88, which is going to mean that the oar's centered length is 288 centimeters, and then the inboard length is 88 centimeters. In any adjustable oar, that's going to be the center point of that range, and so you're going to be able to usually extend 4 to 5 centimeters up and down from that. And so if it's a 288/88, then you're probably going to be able to get an outboard of 292/88 down to 284/88, and the oar keep it at 288/84 to 288/92. All right, so if you're adjusting one and not the other. Now, generally, there's gonna be a recommended area for your collar to be. So if you're putting your collar all the way down here or all the way up here, it's not gonna be as close to what the oar was designed for. Same thing with the handle. If you're getting all the way to the edge of that handle, that handle's going to have less grip in the oar. You might be a little bit more likely to damage that oar, though the manufacturer is not going to put markings on it at the point beyond where it can safely be used. All right, but keep that in mind, is that you don't want to just frivolously choose that center point in terms of your oar measurements. You want to be roughly having a good idea of what measurements you're going to use the most for your rowing, and then kind of pick that as your oar measurements. So now, how do you determine that? You're talking about all these measurements, Travis, but I don't know what any of that means. All right, so we're going to convert that into two different numbers. One, we're going to keep that inboard setting, which is an important one to know, and then the other is we're going to use what's called the outboard. All right, so the outboard is just the distance from that water side of the collar to the tip of that blade. All right, so the overall length is going to be the combination of those two, but the overall length is really not something I think about when I'm gearing an oar for a boat. And so the inboard, I'm primarily going to adjust that based on comfort and mechanics. So technically, where is that handle traveling through the stroke? All right, so if you have more inboard, you're going to have more overlap through the center. All right, and then you're also going to have kind of a more leverage on the inboard of that pin. So the longer your inboard, the easier it's going to be to move that blade quickly through the arc. All right, but the drawback is that you've got more that you've got to deal with on the inside. And so what generally happens is that a shorter athlete is going to require a shorter inboard, and a taller athlete is going to be able to take advantage of a longer inboard. Now, the best way to do is kind of set between a combination of your inboard and your foot stretchers, so that you're finishing in a scull with your blade handles right about there. All right, so right about where the ribs are turning. The range that I've seen, I've seen some athletes might finish out here. You definitely don't want to finish past the body, so you might want to finish a little wider here. And then some athletes will prefer tighter, and I've seen some actually finish kind of in front of the body. You're talking about maybe 1% or 2% of the athletes out there that would benefit from that. But I would say 90% of the athletes are going to be best finishing kind of in this range. Now, there's three factors going to determine where your handle is finishing there. One is going to be how much distance is between your pins, or between the center of your boat and your pin if you're sweep. How long that inboard is. All right, so all else being equal, the longer your inboard, the tighter your hands are going to be at the release, the farther away they'll be if it's shorter. But the other factor to consider is where your foot stretchers are. All right, so moving your foot stretchers back, all other things considered equal, is going to move you back here because you're traveling essentially farther within the arc. All right, but moving yourself farther back with your foot stretchers is also going to mean that when you're at the catch, all right, that you're not able to get as far and as wide. All right, so being comfortable in the boat and finding a good load and finding the appropriate inboard is a combination of those three factors. That goes well beyond the scope of this video. You're gonna have to work with a coach to do it. But for the most part, most people have found the foot strider position that works for them and the pin position that works for them. And so you can kind of adjust a little bit with those oars to find the right load and feeling of going through the water. Because it's very easy to adjust the handle in and out when you're rowing. You just gotta take a screwdriver or a little wrench and just kind of loosen it, slide it where you need to, tighten it back. Very easy, just as easy as changing your foot stretcher. The only thing that's not easy is changing where your pin is. But I would recommend going out with your oars and just row 2 minutes, adjust that handle, maybe half a centimeter longer, half a centimeter shorter, row 2 minutes, see how it feels, adjust it again, and keep doing that longer and longer and longer, and then shorter and shorter and shorter, and figure out what works best for you. And then as you get longer, you can experiment with, all right, if my handles are longer, maybe I gotta bump my foot stretcher a little bit to the bow to give myself room. Is that extra leverage on the oar going to trump the loss of leverage of angle at the front end? As you shorten it, same thing. You're gonna lose leverage in terms of torquing that blade and getting that blade moving quickly through the water. You're gonna get a little bit more freedom at the back end, which is gonna allow you to push the foot stretcher forward and get a bit more length at the front end, a little bit more angle, all right? So it's a very dynamic system, a lot of things interacting together. The best thing, and what I would always do with my athletes, especially high performance athletes in the summer when we had a lot more time, we would just dedicate a day, maybe 2 days over the course of summer to just play with our equipment and our rig, and we would just go out, row for a couple minutes, adjust, row for a couple minutes, adjust, row for a couple minutes, adjust, whether it was the handle, whether it was the foot stretcher, whatever it might be, and just find what works and what felt comfortable and what looked like it was moving the boat more effectively. So that's what we do with the inboard. Now the outboard, I would use to adjust kind of the loading and leverage on the boat, almost kind of like the damper setting. So while adjusting your inboard is gonna change how heavy that stroke feels or how light that stroke feels, that is not the primary method I would use to adjust that feeling, all right? I would use the inboard primarily for mechanics and technique and getting comfortable and feeling leverage. If I wanted to change the load, I would change the outboard, all right? So you would just move this collar here up or down to either shorten the outboard on the blade or lengthen the outboard on the blade. Now you're definitely going to want to change that based on what boat you're in, and I would do this often. I think I was kind of definitely in a minority in terms of doing this often with my scullers, to the point where it does take a little bit of time, but it's very easy to do. So if you just train your scullers how to do it themselves, you can just have them do it. And I would recommend going and checking it real quick because they do make mistakes. But it only takes a minute to check 12 sets of sculling oars and make sure everything is right, whereas it might take 20 minutes for you personally to do all the sculling oars. But I would recommend adjusting that collar between boats. The outboard in the single should be your shortest outboard in a double, kind of a little bit longer than that, outboard in a quad, longer than that, all right? And generally I would say it was usually 1 to 2 centimeters difference between each of those. So for my female scullers, which was the majority of my scullers that I would coach through the year, we would do usually about a, 196 outboard for the single. Sometimes we could adjust that down to 194 if we were working with kind of a younger or smaller athlete, but 196 for the outboard, and then it would go up to about 198 for our doubles. That was pretty consistent, I found, for all doubles, and then up to 200 for the outboard in the quad. And then I would usually add about 2 or 3 to those range for male athletes. And so I know our quad that got medal at nationals was, I want to say they were probably 203 outboard, maybe 202 outboard, 200 on the outboard in the double, and a lot of them actually still use 200 outboard in the single, and we would just adjust the pin and the inboard of the shaft. But you know, personally these days I generally like to row with a outboard of about 198, 197 as a master's athlete that is not quite in the shape that I used to be. So a little bit of idea there for what outboards to use. The inboards, based on height, generally the shorter oars, so someone in the kind of like, 5'7" or under range, you might want to kind of get down into that 87 inboard, though that is starting to add, make it a little bit heavier feeling. If I was coaching middle school athletes, I might even go down to 86, really short ones that are around 5 foot, maybe even a little bit shorter. So make sure they're not getting kind of cramped up and they can move their stretcher back enough to get, a good release position or forward enough. But for the most part, 88 to about 91-ish, I think, is kind of the most popular range of those inboards. I know I use between an 88, 89. I might have used a 90 every once in a while in my own career as a high performance lightweight. So that's with a 2K and the 620s, and kind of winning national championships, Canadian Henley. So, pretty fast, but I think 89, 90 is what we used in the double when we won the double at senior national championships. And then these days, though, I tend to use more 88. I tend to have like a little bit more room when I'm taking my strokes. For the female athletes, generally I would say standard size female athlete, so about my size, would be an 88, 89 maybe. The taller female athletes, so once you're getting up to like 5'11", maybe over 6 foot, then they can kind of experiment with that 90, 89, 90. Longer is going to be better, all right, but you can only take advantage of that if you're a tall athlete, all right. You can't stick a 5'6" athlete in and give them a 90 inboard and expect things to go well. You have to kind of, use that inboard to what's mechanically going to be efficient, and then adjust the outboard and the pin position and the foot stretcher position to get the loading right. So those are the ranges. Another trick that you can use is look up information. There's a lot of rig charts if you look on the internet for World Championship rig numbers, where they basically just done a survey of all the countries and what they were using for their rig. My suggestion, I think that would be easier for male athletes than it would be for female athletes, because most male athletes can go and find, most average male athletes can go and find a high performance female athlete that is similar size and speed to them, and a lot of these adjustments are based on that size and speed, not necessarily based on the gender. Unfortunately, you're not going to find a lot of that info if you're a recreational female athlete, because there's nobody competing at that level that's pulling a 8-minute 2K, all right? But you can kind of look at the trend, okay? Well, between heavyweight and lightweight, there's about this much different in your 2K, maybe about 30 seconds, for a woman in your 2K, and then that therefore produces this much of a difference in terms of the oar length or the inboard or the pin position. So if I then extract that roughly linearly to the loss in speed from that elite lightweight female to a kind of a high school recreational female, what numbers range would they give you? And not saying that it's going to be right, but it's going to give you a decent startup point to start your experimentation. So these are the things to think about with the oar. Let's pause here and think to see if I forgot anything. The final thing I'll say as a caveat, and this is really just going to be for program managers, is a trick that I found in terms of letting athletes and easily managing all my sets of oars. Again, we had multiple dozens of sets of sculling oars, a lot of athletes on the water at a time, athletes moving between single, double, quad. It was very important that they had the right set of oars for what we wanted to achieve that day and what boat they were in. The way we did that is actually you had to develop a system with the collar and the sleeve. And so again, we use mostly Dreyer oars in my program. In Dreyer, you have an option between a red and a black sleeve and a red and a black collar. And so I use those colors to basically allow athletes to tell how big their handle were and how stiff their shaft was. All right, so all of our shafts were either soft or a standard stiffness shaft. We didn't have any stiff shafts in our program because we didn't have any 6-minute 2Ks in our program. With the grip, those were either a small diameter or a standard diameter handle. Again, coaching mostly youth, there were no 6'6" dudes, 220 pounders, all right? So not any big giant hands. So what we do is we would just say, all right, well, all the black sleeves are soft stiffness, all the red sleeves are standard stiffness, All of the black collars were a small diameter handle. All of the red collars were a standard diameter handle. And that's where I could easily go. Athletes knew that they should always be getting soft oars if they were females. If they were smaller, most females needed a soft shaft, so they're always black, black. If we had a lightweight guy, then he would do a black red. All right, so soft, so standard handle and soft shaft. All right, so whatever it might be, red, standard stiffness shaft, standard diameter handle. And so that's a trick. I highly recommend color coding in some way so the athletes can pick out the right set of oars, and you can just kind of go. I also recommend teaching the athletes to be able to look at the length of the oar, all right, and check in their inboard real quick. Have a tape measure nearby so that when they're grabbing a set, that they know kind of what their inboard is and what their outboard is, and so they can decide. All right. Obviously, if you're coaching very large groups, it's hard to train everybody like this. But certainly, when I got to the high performance groups, those athletes should know, what dimensions to use on their oars. All right, everybody, that is it. Very comprehensive buyer's guide. I'm not quite sure if I'm splitting this up into multiple parts or if it's just going to be one big video with chapters on it, but that should answer all the questions that you have in order to select the right set of oars. I know that the last thing you want is to spend 900, $1,000 on a brand new set of sculling oars for yourself and then row with them for a couple months and not quite be happy with what you got, or be struggling with something that is an equipment issue rather than a you issue, and then just be stuck in this place where, I don't have another $1,000, or best case scenario, you can sell those, eat a couple $100 on the turnaround and the resale, and then go buy another set of oars with the dimensions that you want. So hopefully this helps you avoid that. If you have further experience with this, suggestions, if I missed anything, if you disagree with something, if you think you had a better suggestion of what to pick and why to pick it, put it in the comments below. Keep it constructive, obviously, and hopefully we can all help each other kind of avoid that pitfall of buying the wrong sets of oars, all right, especially sculling. If there's enough demand, I can also make this for my experience with the sweep oars and what to get for sweep. Though if you're buying sweep, you're buying for a program, and that means that, you can afford to pay for some advice. So I encourage you to go over to GTS Rowing, pay for some general consulting. One of the benefits of that general consulting is talking about equipment, so I'm happy to talk with program administrators to help you select the right equipment for your program, make a decision on that. And beyond that, for individuals out there that are looking to single scull, that consultation options that I have on gtsrowing.com, in addition to all the remote coaching that I do, I'm more than happy to kind of take your information, your specific situation, and confirm that you are indeed picking the right specs on your oar before you go ahead and pull the trigger and drop, $1,000 on a set. All right, so nice to spend $50 to make sure that you're not wasting $1,000. So you use that if you can. I'm happy to help. But otherwise, thanks for listening. Hope this helped you avoid some of the mistakes that I made in terms of getting those oars and being like, I wish I had those other oars instead. And we can all have fun going fast on the water and feeling comfortable on the water. Thanks, everyone. This is Travis signing off.